Hi, I'm Bill Arnold. Thank you for listening to this podcast. There are many more podcasts available at myfaithradio.com. Your support makes this possible. Thank you. And a warm welcome to the afternoon show. I'm Bill Arnold, and it is going to be a spectacular day. I'm looking forward to spending time with you. I've got Dr. Michael Wise with me today in the first hour and Dr. Marcus Bachman in the second hour, so we've got a great show for you. We're going to talk about Paul today, some of the unknown origins of the Apostle Paul. And this is going to be an absolutely fascinating discussion, so please don't touch that dial. Dr. Michael Wise is a scholar in residence. He's a professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient languages here at the University of Northwestern. He has his PhD from the University of Minnesota and a PhD from the University of Chicago. We have almost nothing in common, Michael. Seriously.
You like Chicago?
I like Chicago, but...
Well, there we go.
Yeah, I guess we do have something in common. So anyway, this is going to be a conversation. I looked at some of the things you're going to discuss today, and I can't wait to have this discusussion. So let's start off a little bit about the new information about the Apostle Paul's origins. Now, is this something that has only been recently discussed in American circles?
Yes, it is, Bill. It's actually, people will find this interesting, and we'll talk about this more if you wish to do so.
I wish.
But it's something that's relatively commonly understood in Germany, for example, among German scholars. Mm-hmm. Not so much necessarily among lay people in Germany, but among scholars. And then in the United States, it's almost unknown.
That's so fascinating.
And we'll explain why.
Yeah. Aren't we in America just rabid consumers of information about God and the Bible and Paul? How do we not know?
Well, our scholars are not as well trained as Germans.
Very interesting.
In some cases.
Very interesting. All right, let's talk about who were the Zealots and why is it important to know about them?
So part of this story that we're going to be talking about today involves understanding these people. Now, we know the term zealot. It's somebody who's really, on fire for something. Mm-hmm. But it's actually a term that was used in ancient times, say about the time of Jesus' birth, and for some 100 years or so after that, to describe a certain group like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Christians, by the way, groups among the Jews who were distinct and could be understood and seen as particular. And so the Zealots were people who were convinced that God had already brought the end to the kingdoms of men that were to rule over them. So now we're thinking of the book of Daniel and the four kingdoms that are talked about there. And you'll remember there's the fifth kingdom that arises at the end, which is a stone that is cut out without hands and smashes a mountain, and that gives rise to a new kingdom, the kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. And the book of Daniel gives clues about when that might come with certain numbers that have always been very controversial. How do we understand them? But the ancient people already believed that they were at the time that Daniel had talked about. We talk about it as though now is the time, and some Christians believe that, but they already believed that at the time of Jesus. So you can see how controversial this has been. In fact, one statement that's been made is that the book of Daniel has been at the center of more wars than any book you can name. And that's because of these figures and how people have interpreted them. And so the Zealots were convinced that God was now supposed to be king, and no human group or human kingdom should rule over them. And so they were freedom fighters, basically, who arose and wanted to throw off the yoke of Rome. And this came to at different times, this came sort of to the surface and actually resulted in fighting. At other times, it was kind of a smoldering fire ready to break out. But it was especially alive in Galilee, which, of course, is where Jesus is from. That area was very much a hotbed for zealot thinking. And that's a factor in what we're going to be talking about today when we're talking about the origins of the Apostle Paul. We need to understand that, in particular, a place by the name of Gush Chalav in Hebrew, but
Wait, did you just clear your throat?
I did. That's what you do in Hebrew when you make this sound.
Okay, because I didn't know if you needed to drink of water or what.
Yeah. Chalav. Chalav is just a word that means cream.
Okay.
Or milk.
Okay.
So it's a very good thing, actually. So this village or town is usually called Gishala in English. That Hebrew word comes to us through Greek to become Gishala.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to play a role in our discussion today, Bill.
Okay.
And so folks need to kind of have that as something they know before we can make sense of some other things we're going to say.
Okay, so let's go back to the Zealots, the freedom fighters. They had it right?
Were they right about this? No. They were not right, as became evident when, in fact, Jerusalem fell.
Okay.
But they were fighting it at that time, too.
Mm-hmm.
So again and again, Daniel, Bill, was a bestseller at the time of the war with Rome that broke out in AD 66.
What does that mean?
It was widely read, and it was a motivation for the war.
Okay.
Yep. We know that from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is something we have talked about a little bit in the past. That's a big field, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But, we have 8 copies of the Book of Daniel among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they all date to just about the time before the war. Very interesting.
That's fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah.
People were reading Daniel like crazy, and that's because they believed that Daniel was telling them about what was going to happen. And the Zealots were the ones who were really firing people up about that. This was right down their alley, right? It was their thinking that people were buying.
What was the other camp saying?
The Pharisee approach, which was ultimately going to prevail in the history of Judaism,
Mm-hmm.
was that one should be passive about things like this and allow God to work. So you don't rise up and try to create the kingdom by human force of arms.
Mm-hmm.
You let God bring it. And, of course, that is much closer to the teachings of our Lord as well. He speaks against those who try to bring the kingdom with force. Of course, he has a different idea of the kingdom as well, but the nature of the kingdom and how you get it. The Zealots were very militant. They were not. Look, we've got Zealots today. They're called terrorists. From a certain perspective, they're fighting for freedom as they understand it,
Mm-hmm.
from their own frame of reference. And that's part of the issue that's going on right now and creating such a political schism in our own country
Mm-hmm.
between Americans and those who have one view of things in Israel and what's going on, and with regard to the fight with the Palestinians who believe that their land has been stolen from them. And there's, of course, quite a good following from the Palestinian side of things now in the United States. Mm-hmm. So we can understand, I think, how some people would say one thing and some another about the same set of events and the same circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, so nothing is new under the sun and very little changes over time, right?
Well, that's true.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Michael Wise is my guest as we were talking about the unknown origins of the Apostle Paul. Michael, who is Jerome and why is he important to the story of Paul?
So we're going to dive into this story, Bill, and we've got our background about Gishala. So Jerome, most people will perhaps have heard of the Vulgate,
Yes.
the standard Catholic Bible in Latin.
Mm-hmm.
He is the one who was commissioned to produce that by a pope by the name of Damasus, not to be confused with Damascus, in AD 382. So now we've gone some centuries beyond the time of Paul, but here's the thing. He not only translated from Greek and Hebrew in creating this Latin Bible, and so was the great scholar of his day, but along the way while he translated, he wrote commentaries on some of the biblical books. And one of the books he wrote on, in fact, is very interesting, is the book of Philemon, which, as you remember, is the story of a slave by the name of Onesimus,
Mm-hmm.
who has fled his master, has come to Paul, and Paul now sends him back to his master with a letter, which we call Philemon, that's the name of the master, asking him to set this slave free permanently and send him back to Paul. And we'll talk more about this.
In spite of his shady past.
In spite of his shady past. And in the course of commenting on that book, because Jerome writes a commentary on the book of Philemon, he says the following thing about the Apostle Paul, which I've got as a quote here for you. And I think it records the early church's memory of the apostle, which we have lost track of in American and English scholarship. Here's what it says. They say that the parents of the Apostle Paul were from Gishela. You remember that town? A region of Judea, and that when the whole province was devastated by the hand of Rome and the Jews scattered throughout the world, they, that is his parents, were taken to Tarsus, a city of Cilicia. That's the quote. Now you'll remember that Paul says he's a citizen from Tarsus. That was in what we would call today the very southeastern portion of Turkey, just as you come around and you start heading down the coast into today's Lebanon and Syria. That's where it was located. Paul was from there. Now, what Jerome is telling us is how it was that Paul ended up being born there. And what he's saying is that Paul's parents were freedom fighters in Galilee, associated with Gishela, and that when the Romans took reprisals against those who were rising up against them, these zealot-type people, one of the things they did was sell them into slavery. And they
sold Paul's parents into slavery?
They sold them into slavery.
Wow.
And that was how they got taken to Tarsus. Okay. That's what it means when it says, this is written in Latin, you understand, and the implication of the phrase, they were taken to Tarsus, is that it's against their will. It's forcible. They're being sold. This was a common Roman practice. In fact, you'd find it interesting. As the Romans waged war, they were commonly followed by slave traders in caravans right behind the Roman forces, who made a huge killing off of the Roman conquest. People that didn't get killed were sold into slavery. The slavers were right behind the Romans. They were right there to do the dealing. They had their contacts. They could send the people on, and that's how the Romans operated. When you rose up against Rome, or you stood against Rome, you had better win.
Yeah.
Because the Romans made an object lesson out of people who did that and didn't win. And that was a common thread in the history of our Lord's period of time in the region of Judea. Several wars, and always the end was that the Romans were winners.
So, Michael, Paul's parents became prisoners of war. They were sold into slavery into Tarsus, but then they eventually got set free?
They were eventually set free.
And how did that happen?
So here's the way that slavery worked in the Roman world, and it's different from what we're used to thinking. We're used to the American paradigm, right, where we had these terrible slaver ships that brought people over for a couple of centuries from Africa. They traveled to England. They traveled to the United States. They carried people that were bound under down under the deck of the ship and didn't come out for a couple of months, darkness and death and stench and all that horror. Roman slavery was not nearly that bad for most people. Sometimes it could be if you got sent to the mines. That was a death sentence. But if you were sold into slavery in a typical situation, you, like, say, Paul's parents, you would end up in somebody's home serving them as servants, what we might call servants. So sometimes people translate the Greek word doulos, which means slave in the New Testament, as bondservant to try to get across this idea. It's not quite like our slave. It's more like being an apprentice who has, or somebody who's got a bond that they have to pay off. Eventually, you can get out. So it was common that when people were enslaved, that when they got into their 30s or maybe 40 years old, which was not young in that world, you have to understand, but nevertheless, they would be set free. And those people who were set free were known as free men. Even if they were women. The title was free man, for that person. They would always be known as a former slave, but now not a slave. As a free man, they would have certain obligations towards their former owners, and typically they were treated as a member of that person's family and still continued to be in relation with those people, but now as free people living on their own. And not infrequently, their children were actually adopted. So if Paul's parents are sent to Tarsus, they have Paul while they're there, and later his father is set free and becomes a freedman. Paul would have received Roman citizenship, as would his father. That's what happened when you got set free.
Okay.
That's not a bad deal. In the Roman world, to be a Roman citizen was huge because you didn't pay taxes. Whereas if you were not a citizen, you did. I mean, it was no different then than it is now. I mean, imagine if you were in a special category, you did not pay income taxes. What would that be worth to you?
I'm trying to figure out how I can become a Roman citizen right now.
Yeah, well, first you have to be a slave.
Oh, I don't want to do that.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I knew there was a downside, Michael. You just didn't tell me that. All right, we're going to take a little break. Dr. Michael Wise is my guest. We're talking about the unknown origins of the Apostle Paul. We'll be right back.
The Bible is valuable, and reading and studying the Bible can transform your life. Hi, I'm Angela Smith, host of Reading the Bible Together podcast. Several times a year, we release a new Reading the Bible Together study. We've studied Luke, Daniel, Advent, Lent, and so many more. You can access all of our studies for free by going to the Reading the Bible Together resource page at myfaithradio.com. In addition to the studies, we also have the accompanying podcast. You can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. You can study on your own, or if your small group or Bible study is looking for what to study next, check out the Reading the Bible Together resource page at myfaithradio.com.
Welcome to the show. I hope you had a great weekend. I'm so glad to have Dr. Michael Wise here with me in studio. We're talking about the unknown origins of the Apostle Paul. This is really interesting, Michael. I know there's more about about Paul's parents in the history of the early church. I know that you talked about some of what Jerome revealed about his parents, but what else is there? I know there's got to be more.
There is. Fortunately, there is. There's an additional record that was written down a few centuries after the time of Jerome, and this is involving a guy by the name of Photius I, who was actually the bishop of Constantinople, what we call today, of course, Istanbul.
Okay.
Right? For a long time, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And he gives us information in a writing that he has left for us. He was a man with a large library, and he had a particular historian in his library that he was reading as he was writing what I'm about to talk to you about. We don't know the name of that historian, and that writing has not survived. So what I'm about to share with you is only available to us in his comment. But here's what he says. He says, Paul, the divine apostle, who had laid hold of the Jerusalem above as his fatherland, so you can see he's kind of flowery with his language, right? Had also of his portion the fatherland of his ancient ancestors and physical race, namely Gishela, which is now a village in the realm of Judea, being called of old a small town. But because his parents, together with many others of his race, were taken captive by the Roman spear, and Tarsus fell to his lot, where he was also born, he gives it as his fatherland. That's the quote. So Paul was, according to Photius, born in Tarsus as a result of his parents being involved in this rebellion against Rome up in Galilee, especially with regard to the city of Gishela. So Paul's parents came from Gishela. John of Gishela is a name well known to historians of the time of the war that the Jews fought against the Romans that ended in the destruction of the temple, because he was actually one of the faction leaders. Here's something crazy. If you don't mind, we just kind of go off for a second.
No, please.
It was a regular thing that whenever the Jews fought the Romans, they also had a civil war. You say, well, that doesn't sound like a good idea. How can you win a war when you're fighting yourself too? Yeah, that's right. They didn't win. But so That happened 3 times. So the war we're talking about, where the temple was destroyed, it was happening again. And one of the factions was led by a guy from Gisela, the very town which we are now learning from this more recent the material that's being discussed, was also the place from which Paul's parents came, not too much different in time, right? So they probably had lived in Gisela approximately the year 4 or 5 A.D., and out of Gisela, 65 years later, comes this guy named John, who leads a faction of the Jews who, while the Romans are surrounding the city of Jerusalem with their armies later to destroy the temple, that faction is fighting against 2 others and ends up burning the food supplies of the city.
Whoa.
To make sure that no one else can get them. That's not a good idea when you're being invested by an army. So this craziness that was part of the zealot mindset, right? You kind of, I'll take a punch, the hardest one you can give, as long as I get to hit you, right? Mm-hmm. Kind of mindset. That was the background of Paul's parents. Paul calls himself a zealot, I remind you.
Wow.
As we'll say more about. This mindset was a mindset that ultimately was going to be turned, in Paul's case, to his devotion to the Lord and the message of Christ. But before that, you will remember, it had other ends that it was turned against. And it was at first, of course, the Christians. Mm-hmm. So Photius has Paul's parents enslaved, and in the process of this reprisal for having been part of the revolt, and they are sent to Tarsus in their enslaved situation, i.e., sold to somebody there as a slave. And Paul is born later, and he comes out of that setting. So Paul is born as a slave. That's probably totally new and shocking.
It is shocking because I'm thinking of Philippians 3 right now, where Paul's pretty much given his resume: circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee, as for zeal, persecuting the church, as for righteousness based on the law, faultless.
Yes.
This is the resume you get from growing up as a slave?
This is the resume you get from being a zealot.
Okay.
Because what is a zealot? What is a zealot? Somebody who is full of zeal for the law of God. You see, in that world, that was actually a positive, not a negative, because you were willing to do anything to fight for the honor of God. That's what would arouse zeal. Somebody
for the law?
Not necessarily the law per se, but the God of Israel's honor and defending it. So in the case of Paul and his attitude towards the Christian church, why would that be a matter of zeal?
Yeah.
Because they were declaring that this guy Jesus was the Messiah, when the law specifically said that anybody who was hung on a tree, which was known to have happened to Jesus, he was crucified, was declared thereby in the law, and it's in Deuteronomy chapter 22, that anybody who's hung on a tree, talui al ha'etz in Hebrew, is by definition then under God's wrath and accursed of God. So if Paul's saying, look, if you call somebody who is accursed of God, the Messiah who is anointed of God, that is spitting on the name of God. That's blasphemous. That arouses zeal. That's why he was after the Christians.
Interesting.
So Paul grew up in a zealot household, and he had a zealot's mindset.
Okay.
And that was not a negative. It was not a negative when he said that to other Jews. Many Jews were zealous for the law.
Michael, talk a little bit more about that passage out of Deuteronomy, because that is so interesting, that anyone who hangs on the tree is cursed and has the wrath of God on him.
Yes.
And Paul would, of course, known that.
Yes.
And so that's why he was so zealot against the Christians.
The main reason that Paul was against the Christians was what we just said. this claim about Christ,
Gotcha.
the way that it played against the law, so to speak.
Yeah.
And the law of blasphemy is fairly clear, just to make sure that everybody who's listening understands what that means, because we have different understandings today than necessarily they might have had with certain words. Blasphemy meant to say something that attacked the honor of God, and that could be a lot of different things, right? You could say, for example, that God didn't care about the temple anymore. That's what got Stephen killed. That was considered blasphemous because God lived in the temple. They thought, the people that were against him. What are you talking about? Saying that God doesn't care about his temple is an attack on him, an attack on the law of Moses, which he gave us, because the law of Moses talks about the tabernacle, which was long known to be the source of the plan for the temple. So you're attacking God by saying that. That'll get you killed, and Stephen was stoned. Blasphemy was a capital offense, and the penalty was death by stoning, which is a very bad way to go. They aim at your head and try to break it open like a melon. And when it breaks open like a melon, they know that you're dead. That's how it works.
Yikes. All right, Dr. Michael Wise is my guest, and we are continuing this discussion of the unknown origins of the Apostle Paul. Before we go to break, Michael, I want to ask you a little bit about when you said Photius I. Of course, that's the first time I've ever heard that name, Photius I.
Or the Photius the First, because
Photius the First, yes.
It was a well-known name, not to be confused with photograph or something.
Exactly.
He's not a photo.
Right. So Photius the First.
Yes.
And so we have this understanding that Paul was born a slave, and this is supported by Photius's writings. How do we come to understand that that information is reliable?
Well, there's a German term for this, because a lot of the discussion that we're having today is based on German scholars and things that they've been talking about for a long time that American scholars and therefore American people in general don't know. The German term is unfindbar. If something is unfindbar, it means it's unfathomable that somebody would say this unless it's true.
Okay.
So think about it. Would somebody make up what we're saying about Paul? Well, Gisela is not in the Bible, so it has no connection with biblical stories or the Old Testament. There's no connection in this whole story with Paul's tribe of Benjamin, which was, of course, a good biblical thing. You want to tell a story about Paul, a Benjaminite, but that's not going on. It has no association, this whole story, with the Galilean ministry of Jesus, even though the area of Galilee is part of the story. This is not something anybody would make up. This is a way of reasoning that scholars use. I mean, because remember, when we're talking about history, for the most part, we are talking about arguments from probability. Most things that we assert or that we defend as historical arguments are based on a certain amount of data and then reasoning from that data. And the data is not usually compelling in the sense that you have no choice but to agree, right? So arguments are probabilistic. And when you're in an environment of thinking like that, and this is common in history, then if something is unfindbar, in other words, nobody would make this up. If that sounds true, that's a good argument. So therefore, I think, and most scholars that come to this question think, that Photius is a reliable source in what he's saying.
Plus, I want to start using the word unfindbar in my everyday language.
I think that's unfindbar.
You think that's unfindbar?
Yes, it's unthinkable that you would do that.
Oh, well, you got another thing coming, Michael Wise. All right, we're going to take a break and come back. We're going to learn more about the unknown origins of the Apostle Paul with Dr. Michael Wise. If you have a question or comment, you can, of course, text it over. Love to hear from you. 877-933-2484. Again, 877-933-2484.
It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold. Prime time, drive time, the let's get it started. Jump in your car. Yeah. What's for dinner? Hey. It's the afternoon show with Bill Arnold.
We're talking about the unknown origins of the Apostle Paul, and hopefully at the end of this hour you will know some of the origins of the Apostle Paul. My guest is Dr. Michael Wise, and we are open to questions if you have them. One came in, Michael. Does Michael have any thoughts on Jesus' statement to Paul? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. I know a goad is a sharp stick, but are the goads in his Jewish beliefs that are motivating him, or the new movement started by Jesus?
It's a great question. Just to remind everybody, a goad is kind of a weird word, but it means a sharp stick. In ancient times, it was used to direct the movement of a cow or an animal. So you kind of use it to keep them from going off in the wrong direction or to keep them on the right path. And so what Jesus is saying to Paul is, look, you are feeling certain impetus to move in a certain direction, and you don't want to go there, but that's hard because it hurts to get poked by the goad. So Paul was arresting Christians and bringing them to, in some cases, to be stoned for blasphemy. In other cases, they were getting probably a lesser punishment because there were sometimes some mercy involved in these kind of things, but they were open to that capital punishment, and people could be given that punishment. And so Paul was dealing with these Christians, and I think many of them were very nice, decent, honorable, intelligent people. And what was this craziness that they were willing to go to death for? And Paul was talking to these people and being affected by the fact that these people were fine, intelligent Jews that were otherwise admirable for him. And so Jesus is saying, look, you're starting to think this might be true, what they say. And it's hard for you at this point to continue going the way you are. That's what he's saying. Paul was struggling again with this whole idea of what was going on. Of course, he was tremendously conflicted because on the one hand, he saw what was happening to good people because of him. But on the other hand, he still had that conviction that this was contrary to Scripture and that people were dishonoring God. He was struggling with that problem. What to do? Mm-hmm. Jesus, of course, knows that.
Thank you for that answer. Dr. Michael Wise is my guest. Michael, Karen, we're talking about, we've all said Saul of Tarsus. We've all said that 1,000 times, minimum. But we really don't know much about Saul being from Tarsus and being born a slave. Why don't we ever hear about that?
Well, here's the interesting thing, Bill. Like I was saying at the beginning here, in German scholarship, this is a commonplace. In American scholarship, it's almost unheard of. And so you can read any number of commentaries on Romans, which I've often done, and never come across this idea in English. So why is that? Well, partly it's a legacy of of the 19th century. Because today a lot of ideas that circulate as common ideas arise from scholarship that was done in the 19th century, 1800s. And especially in those times and into the early 20th century, German scholars were often better educated than English-speaking scholars, whether in America or England. In the area of the classics, Greek and Latin, like literature, and in the study of the church fathers, or what we call patristics. So these sources that I've been talking to you about up until now are written in those languages, Greek and Latin, and they are written by church fathers. And those things were not always the areas of comfort for American scholars and English scholars that they were for German scholars, who were, as I say, they were really, really thoroughly trained in Greek and Latin from the time they were little for many, many years before they entered biblical studies. It was just part of the educational tradition of that era. Everybody learned Greek and Latin who had a good education. And the people who were really smart and became scholars learned it even better. So they knew these sources in ways that the people that wrote in English didn't. that's why they knew these things. And that's why and still we have this legacy. So a lot of what's written about in scholarship, as I was saying, is discussion of ideas that have been around for a while. And if they aren't known to have been around, they don't get discussed. That's what this is. This is fascinating and I think accurate and true information that has survived from the early church's memories that has just been neglected because of the sort of dark corners in which it was hidden.
So do you have an approximate time frame as to how old this information is?
Well, we can reason about that. So here's the interesting thing. I was talking about Jerome, who was writing this commentary on Philemon, and he knows this tradition that Paul's family was associated with Gisela, this town in Galilee, and they were zealot types, and they were taken into slavery and sold into slavery in Tarsus. He knows this tradition, and he writes about it in the book of commentary on Philemon, which we'll talk about more, because that connection with Philemon matters to our whole story. But why does he know about it himself? Here's the thing. He was not an original scholar when it comes to these commentaries. He was relying on an earlier source that we know. It itself hasn't survived, but he often quoted the writings of the early church father Origen, whose name is spelled with an E at the end, not an I, so Origen. Origen was killed as a martyr in the year 250, and he wrote his commentaries on Philemon, for example, back around the year 200. So how old is this idea? It goes back much further than the time of Jerome in 382 we were talking about. He's writing based on the writings of somebody who was alive almost 200 years before him. And Origen was from Caesarea. That's the city on the coast of what we call even today Israel, right? And Caesarea is still a major city there. That was where Origen lived. He was a bishop in Caesarea. So he knew the scuttlebutt and the town's history and the things that people there talked about. And this memory of Paul was known to those folks. And we're only in the second or third generation out from Paul's own time, people who had actually known Paul when we get to 200, right? Paul is alive up to 140 years before that, and people who knew Paul were alive up to 100 years before that, and then people who knew them and then who knew them who knew them. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. We're only a couple generations out in the linkage here. So we're really getting close to the time of Paul himself from an ancient historical way of thinking, where, we just don't have all the sources we wish we did. And we can make a link like this. That's worth it. That's worth something. Mm-hmm. So it's an older tradition, much older.
Mm-hmm. Michael, let's talk a little bit about Paul. So Paul's parents become slaves, and Paul is then born. Does he instantly become a slave as well?
Yes.
Okay.
So you're a slave if your parents are a slave.
Okay.
And but when they're set free, you are too. And so Paul, when he was liberated, likely would have been, this is how it usually worked, Bill. You would, if you're a young person, like he probably was a teenager, you would be adopted by your former master as and the reason for that, you would, not only would you get Roman citizenship, which you were going to get anyway, but you got a name, and then the name of somebody who had elite status, because that's who owned the slaves. And
would the parents have the same status?
They would all be what's called freedmen. Oh,
freedmen, of course.
And a freedman was somebody who had the status that their masters had, essentially. Mm-hmm. If their masters were important, they often were important too. Paul would have been given the three names. There are three typically an upper class Roman had three names. So, and Paul might have been called Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Notice the last name, the third name, that was called the cognomen in Roman terms. The cognomen was the name people were known by oftentimes. That's what cognomen means. And the other two names had to do with their family and their ancestry. So Lucius Aemilius Paulus.
How many times did you practice that in front of the mirror?
I didn't have to because I teach Latin.
I'd have to practice that like 10 times in front of the mirror.
Yeah.
Wyatt's shaking his head.
It's
like,
a
how many
10
times?
seems like on the low side for me.
Oh, yeah.
It'd be more than that for me.
Yeah.
It's a great name. If you
Oh,
think
it's a
about it.
fantastic name. I wish I could repeat it right now, but I can't.
Yes. And so Paul, it's a hypothesis, but it makes sense because that was an important family up in that region. And he was an important general and soldier. His family, that is the name that this is associated with. So Paul probably had two other names besides the one we know. He was known by his cognomen, so he was talked about that way, and we know him that way. He used that name when he was in Greek and Latin-speaking environs, and when he was in Aramaic and Hebrew-speaking environs, he would have been called by his other name, Shaul, or Saul. That was the name he had with his parents at home.
It's so interesting. All right, we're going to take a break and come back as we continue our discussion with Dr. Michael Wise, the unknown origins of the Apostle Paul. We'll be right back. It is my deepest desire that you take the very first step of faith by placing your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. If you've got questions about what it means to begin a relationship with Jesus, text the word faith to 41224. I'm back with Dr. Michael Wise. We're talking about the unknown origins of the Apostle Paul. Maybe some of them at the end of this hour won't be unknown anymore. So, Michael, Paul's got some kind of dual characterization. He's got a zealot going for him, but he's also, at some point a Roman citizen? So how do we put these two together?
That's the advantage of what we're talking about as a theory and explanation for Paul's background, as opposed to other suggestions. Because what we're talking about, that is this enslavement that would have led to his being, at one time being manumitted or set free, and then he gets the name, he gets the citizenship, but he's at heart coming from a zealot family, and that's why they got sold into slavery. The combination is unthinkable. I mean, it's like being a leader of Hamas and also in the Israeli Knesset.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Those two just don't go together.
No.
They do not go together. How could it be? And so sometimes you get scholars who are arguing that it just can't be true. Surely, Paul, this
You
story
almost need
about
to
Paul.
reject it based on that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And yet this makes complete sense of it, how he could be both. And so when we read in the New Testament, we see that sometimes Paul is playing up his kind of zealot side, as, for example, in what we talked about earlier in that passage in Philippians, where he's talking about he's a Hebrew of Hebrews.
Right.
He as to zeal, a persecutor of the church. These are the kind of things that would characterize a zealot, and Jewish folks would admire these statements as part of his resume. But in another setting, he can say to, let's say, a Roman soldier who's just about to torture him, who's arrested him in the temple at Jerusalem, he can say to him, "Is it legal for you to do that to a Roman citizen without trial?" Mm-hmm. And so now it's to his advantage to talk about that.
Sure is.
But if he was talking in Jewish circles, to say he's a Roman citizen would be a no-go in that world. He wouldn't talk about this in those circles. So he's not talking about being a Roman citizen as he's running after Christians to bring them back to be stoned for blasphemy. He's a zealot in those settings. But when he needs to be, he's a Roman citizen. And they're both true. It's not something that the early church or the writers of the New Testament are to be faulted for as a kind of a fairy tale, which is what some scholars that are not really conservative in their views would argue. Mm-hmm. So here's something that we can use as conservative Christians who believe in the authority of Scripture and that it's true in what it says, as a way of explaining facts that are in the evidence of the New Testament, and it honors God in the process because we show that His Word is in fact true.
Michael, I see the significance of the characterization of a zealot on one side of the coin and a Roman citizen on the other. Not to dumb it down, but I mean, Superman, Clark Kent on one side and
Yeah.
Superman on the other.
Yes.
That's the best of both worlds.
It's good.
Yeah, I like that. I had to dumb it down for me, just so you know.
Well, I think it's a good way to think.
Okay, good.
You've got two identities. One of them secret in
Yeah.
some settings, and the
Yeah.
other one's secret in other settings.
And you use it to your advantage. Depends
Right.
on what kind of setting you're in.
When Superman's with Batman, he's not talking about being Clark Kent.
No, he's not.
You know.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when he's with Lois, he could be either.
But he's always Clark Kent.
Yep.
Yeah.
And when he's with Perry or Jimmy,
Yeah.
he's Clark Kent.
All right, let's talk about Philemon. Interesting, unknown guy, right?
Yes, he is.
Why?
So Philemon, if you think about books in the Bible, let me just start by saying this. Paul wrote a lot of letters in his lifetime. A lot. We have evidence for that in a number of directions, which we probably don't have time to discuss. But only certain ones are in the New Testament. In almost every case, we can understand why they would have been interesting to people. For example, the letters to Timothy. Timothy became a famous figure after Paul. He was the leader in Ephesus, which was a central city in early Christianity. Titus, the author, to whom Paul wrote, he was the bishop of Crete, which was an early Christian center. But Philemon, who's that?
right?
Philemon is a lay person in the church at Colossae, a church that Paul didn't even found. He couldn't be more anonymous. Why is he being talked about at all? Well, I hope you can see on the basis of what we've been talking about today, that the letter to Philemon would be of very particular interest in the life of Paul, because Paul himself had been a slave.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know you were going to bring this up. What a great connection point.
Yes. And that was why Onesimus, this was known in the early church, you understand. And so Onesimus, the slave who's the runaway in that letter, runs to Paul to get help with the situation with his master because he knows Paul will understand. Paul's been a slave himself.
So interesting, Michael.
And Paul does understand.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Boy, that makes that letter come alive.
Let me tell you, if we have a moment.
Yeah, we do. In 2 minutes.
Okay. What happens in the after story? Philemon does free Onesimus at Paul's request, which if he hadn't done it, we wouldn't have that letter. Think about it. He wouldn't keep that. He wouldn't even let people know he got that letter from Paul if he didn't do what Paul asked. Onesimus goes on to become the bishop of Ephesus after Timothy. That's an incredible story. He was this former runaway slave, himself becomes the bishop of Ephesus, who comes after the guy who came after Paul. So we have Paul and Timothy, and then Onesimus, and all three of them were martyred for the faith. Paul, Timothy, and Onesimus all died because they were Christians at different times under Roman outbreaks of persecution. It wasn't empire-wide. It was, here and there they would happen. And Paul and the other two all died that way. By the way, scholars believe that the collection of Paul's letters, that began as a separate thing before the whole New Testament. The letters of Paul were circulating. Scholars believe that happened at Ephesus. Maybe by Onesimus. So there's a story.
Yeah, that's an amazing story to think about. Michael, I don't know if this is scientifically verifiable, but I think my IQ is up by 6 points. Because every time you come on, this is what happens.
Well,
I go into this deep thought.
I'm happy to help.
Well, thank you very much. And please come back again soon. Dr. Michael Wise has been my guest. We're going to take a break, and when we return, Dr. Marcus Bachman is going to join us, and we're going to talk about encouragement. I don't think we can ever get enough of that. We'll be right back. Thanks for listening. Programming like this is made available through your support. Information available at myfaithradio.com.
On the latest episode of the Wild God Stories podcast, we go to Africa.
I was raised in Sierra Leone in a community that truly lived the phrase, "It takes a village."
Until one day, the world outside Anita's village broke in.
I didn't grow up in a war zone, but I watched one unfold in the country I love.
God brought hope to her story and many others through radical provision.
God began to direct us towards Uganda, Africa.
I was born and grew up in the countryside of Ethiopia.
Nanjan I met in Kigali, Rwanda.
Discover how God showed up in the middle of war, loss, and impossible odds in Africa. Stories that'll make you say,
"Wow, God.
Wow, God.
Wow, God."
Wow, God Stories. Wherever you get your podcasts.